She quit the ambulance, then ran straight into the only woman she never stopped loving. A burned-out paramedic returns home, and the woman she couldn't stop loving is waiting. The sound of sirens had followed Ruby Lane into her dreams for years. Even after she quit the ambulance, even after she boxed up her uniform and buried it beneath the bed, the echoes chased her. The pitch of despair never stopped. It wasn't just a sound, it was muscle memory. The slam of the back doors. The smell of antiseptic and copper. The grip of a hand going cold beneath her fingers. Tonight, it was raining, and the highway felt like a dark vein running through the center of nowhere. She was driving back to the town she swore she'd never see again, Hawthorne Ridge, a dot on the map and the site of every ghost she carried. Her knuckles were white on the steering wheel. She had no plan except away. Away from the city, the burnout, the endless cycle of life and death that no longer felt noble. Her supervisor called it compassion fatigue. Ruby called it being hollowed out from the inside. She passed the faded sign, "Welcome to Hawthorne Ridge, home of the Hawks," and her chest tightened. She'd been gone almost 8 years. The last time she left, she didn't say goodbye to Shannon. Didn't have the words. Just walked out after a midnight argument that ended with Shannon saying, "If you go, don't expect me to wait." And Ruby didn't. She didn't expect anyone to wait for someone who ran. The old farmhouse appeared just as she remembered, tucked behind a windbreak of pines. Her aunt had died 3 months ago, leaving Ruby the property in her will. A place to heal, the lawyer said. A place to start over. She parked and sat in silence, the wipers beating out a rhythm she couldn't escape. When she finally stepped outside, the air smelled of wet grass and lilacs. The porch light was broken, the screen door hanging crooked. It all looked like it was waiting for her to decide whether to stay or bolt. Inside, the house smelled faintly of cedar and something sweeter, memory, maybe. She set her duffel down and collapsed onto the old couch. The silence felt unnatural after years of chaos. It was too easy to hear her own thoughts. That was when she saw it, the framed photo on the mantel. Her aunt must have found it tucked away somewhere. Ruby and Shannon, 21 and sunburned, arms wrapped around each other at the lake. Shannon's smile was wide and reckless. Ruby's eyes, even then, looked like they were already preparing for loss. She turned the photo face down and whispered, "You're not supposed to still hurt." Outside, thunder rolled. Somewhere down the road, a pickup's headlights cut across the rain. She didn't realize how long she'd been staring until they slowed, then stopped at the gate. For a moment, Ruby's pulse stumbled. No one knew she was here. No one except. The driver's side door opened. A woman stepped out, umbrella snapping open against the wind. Even from a distance, Ruby would have known that walk. Confident. Unrushed. Unafraid. Shannon Hayes. Shannon had aged like a storm, beautiful in her own dangerous way. Her hair was shorter now, streaked with silver near the temples, the kind of change that came from surviving more than just time. Ruby stood frozen in the doorway, barefoot, heart thudding. Shannon tilted her umbrella back. "You planning on saying hello, or are we just gonna stare at each other like ghosts?" Ruby's throat went dry. "I didn't think anyone knew I was here." "Small towns don't keep secrets," Shannon said, stepping onto the porch. "Your aunt's house hasn't had a light on in weeks." Then suddenly, the Lane girl's Jeep shows up. Word travels. Ruby forced a smile. "Still nosy as ever, huh? Still honest as hell." Shannon closed the umbrella and looked her over. "You look like you've seen better years." Ruby huffed a laugh. "You're not wrong. Can I come in, or is this a drive-by reunion?" Ruby hesitated but stepped aside. Shannon walked in, dripping rain on the floor, eyes flicking to the covered photo on the mantel. "You found it." Ruby swallowed hard. "Didn't mean to." It was your aunt's favorite. She said it reminded her that not all things you lose are gone for good. The words hit like a defibrillator jolt. Ruby turned away, pretending to busy herself with the kettle. You want tea or something stronger? Tea's fine. Don't trust your taste in liquor after that college party incident. Ruby snorted. That was 10 years ago. Trauma doesn't expire. Shannon's grin softened. They sat at the old kitchen table, steam curling between them. The silence that used to be comfortable now felt edged. So, Shannon said. Why now? Ruby met her gaze. Because I was falling apart. Shannon didn't flinch. You always carried too much. Comes with the job. You're not still. Paramedic? Not anymore. I quit. The confession felt both shameful and freeing. I couldn't keep losing people. Shannon leaned back, studying her. You didn't come here to die, Ruby. You came here to remember how to live. Ruby's voice cracked. And what if I forgot how? Shannon reached across the table, fingers brushing Ruby's. Then we'll remind you. For the first time in years, Ruby didn't pull away. The following morning broke clear and gold. Ruby woke to sunlight pouring across the wooden floorboards. The kettle still sat out, cold. She had slept through dawn, something she hadn't done since she was a teenager. Outside, the field stretched green and wet, shimmering with dew. She stepped out onto the porch with her coffee and felt the weight of her city years start to slip. Her peace didn't last long. A truck pulled into the driveway, a familiar rusted Ford with Hayes Landscaping painted in faded white letters. Shannon climbed out, wearing work gloves and a grin that could disarm anyone. Your yard looks like it lost a war, she said. Figured I'd volunteer. Ruby laughed. You came all this way to mow my grass? Call it penance for the way we left things. Shannon's gaze softened. You up for company? Ruby hesitated. Every instinct said to keep distance, the kind that prevented old wounds from bleeding. But she nodded anyway. As they worked, the air filled with the smell of cut grass and gasoline. It was domestic in a way Ruby hadn't felt in years. By noon, the fields looked almost alive again. They took a break by the porch steps. Shannon handed Ruby a bottle of water. So, what's next for you? No idea, Ruby said honestly. I thought I'd stay a few weeks. Maybe longer. You saying I'll see you around? Maybe. Good. I've got a feeling you should. Ruby's pulse kicked. You always this sure of yourself? Only when it comes to you. Ruby looked away, pretending to study the treeline. But Shannon's words lingered, steady and unshaken, like a heartbeat she still knew by sound. Hawthorne Ridge had the kind of summer that stuck to your skin. By late afternoon, the heat pressed down in a languid, honeyed way, and the whole town moved slower, softer, like it had agreed to be gentle with itself. Ruby sorted through boxes in the front room, each one a time capsule. Her aunt had kept everything: school programs with Ruby's name under, choir, newspaper clippings about town parades, a curled ribbon from the year Ruby and Shannon won the three-legged race at the county fair. It was all proof that a life had been lived here even while Ruby was busy trying to outrun herself. She found a letter at the bottom of a box, written in Shannon's looping script. It wasn't sealed. It wasn't even finished. Rubes, it began. If I were braver, I'd say this to your face. You're not a fire to be feared. You're the light that found me when I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face. I don't know how to want less of you. The letter ended mid-sentence, the pen stroke trailing into a long scratch. It looked like someone had been interrupted, or had interrupted herself. Ruby sat on the floor, the letter trembling in her hands. She remembered the night they fought, the way fear had worn a mask of anger. There were 1,000 versions of why she left, but the simplest was the truest. she loved Shannon too much to risk watching herself become a husk in front of her. Back then, Ruby thought leaving was a kindness. Now it felt like cowardice dressed in purpose. The screen door squealed. "You look like you found a ghost," Shannon said, stepping inside with a brown paper bag. The kitchen smelled instantly of bread and cinnamon. "Also brought pie, which I will wield as a mood stabilizer." Ruby slid the letter carefully back into the box, as if sudden movement might break the world. "Cinnamon roll pie counts as medicine." "It absolutely does." Shannon set the bag down and then squinted at Ruby's face. "You okay?" "Define okay." "Breathing without lying about it." Ruby huffed. "Then, not great." She nodded to the bag. "Tell me there's coffee." "Always." Shannon moved around the kitchen like she'd never stopped. "You know, I used to practice walking circles in this room, pretending I could steer time." "Why?" "Because everything made sense when I had a destination, even if the destination was the same room." She flicked on the kettle. "You and I were the only uncharted place I've ever been." Ruby wanted to say same, but the word felt like a stone in her throat. They ate at the counter, shoulders touching as if by accident. The pie tasted like 4 clean summers and the clatter of laughter in a barn lit by Christmas lights. It tasted like before. Shannon licked a bit of icing from her thumb, then caught Ruby staring. "What?" Ruby looked away, flushed, and realized with a start that her pulse was yes, yes, yes under her skin. She took a breath. "Stay for dinner?" Ruby asked, quietly, like she might frighten the moment. "I'll cook. Or at least pretend." Shannon's smile tipped, slow and grateful. "I'd like that." Town moved in its own choreography. By the next week, Ruby had a routine, mornings tending to the garden she found buried under waist-high grass, afternoons repairing windows, sanding banisters, reteaching her hands how to do work that wasn't triage. In the evenings, she drove into town for groceries she didn't need, just to walk Main Street and let its ordinary magic rub against her edges. On Thursdays, the farmer's market strung lights between the elms. The air filled with guitar and the blunted thrum of conversation. Ruby bought too many tomatoes, a jar of blackberry jam, and a small bouquet of snapdragons because Shannon once said they looked like laughing mouths. She was paying when a hand brushed her elbow. "Hey, stranger." Shannon wore a butter-yellow shirt with a paint smear near the pocket, sun on her cheeks, and sawdust in her hair. She held a box of seedlings, lavender, basil, a defiant little rosemary struggling to stand straight. "For your porch," she said. "Housewarming for the house that already knows you." Ruby's laugh surprised her. "Thanks." They wandered the stalls. Someone had formed a bluegrass trio out of a banjo, a harmonica, and a man who kept insisting his tambourine was a legitimate instrument. Children ran a feral orbit around the lemonade stand. A golden retriever flirted with everyone. Shannon pointed to the gazebo where a sign-up sheet hung from a clipboard. "The town's hosting a community first aid class next week. How do you feel about teaching it?" A recoil flashed through Ruby before she could moderate it. The word teaching was fine, but the words first aid made her ribs tighten as if a seatbelt had locked across them. "I don't. I'm not sure," she said, careful. Shannon's expression tendered. "You don't have to. I just thought, people trust you. Even if you don't trust it yet." Ruby looked at the clipboard. Names had filled most of the lines, scrawls of parents and grandparents, a pair of teenagers who'd written their names too large, drunk on the idea of being counted. Hawthorne Ridge had a volunteer fire department and a nurse who came in 3 days a week to the clinic. The gaps were the size of disasters nobody thought would happen here. "I'll think about it," Ruby said, which was her adult way of saying I'm scared. Shannon bumped her shoulder. "Good enough." They ended up by the river, where the town kept a strip of lawn that sloped into a soft bend of water. The reeds folded and unfolded in a quiet wind. They sat with their shoes off, toes flirting with the surface. You know, Shannon said, I used to imagine what it would be like if you came back. How'd it go? Badly, she said, grinning. I had a lot more speeches in those versions. Most involved you apologizing in 8 different poetic forms while I pretended to be immune. She sobered. It wasn't about punishment. It was about protecting the part of me that never stopped wanting you. Ruby stared at the water until it blurred. I thought leaving would make it easier to be the person I needed to be. I thought I had to prove I could do hard things on my own. She swallowed. Turns out, I just learned how to be lonely in more than one zip code. Shannon's voice softened. Do you want to try again, Ruby? Not a speech. Not a grand plan. Just a walk we keep taking together until it becomes a road. Ruby's heart climbed into her mouth. I don't know how to do this without breaking you. Stop assuming you're the storm, Shannon said. You're not the damage. You're the one who runs toward it. The words landed like home does when you cross the threshold and the air knows your shape. Ruby felt something align that had been crooked for years. Okay, she said. Let's take the walk. Shannon didn't kiss her. Not yet. She just reached for Ruby's hand, and they sat there in the river-laced light, fingers threaded, letting the future learn to breathe. The first time Ruby woke up shaking after a nightmare, she was back in the ambulance and the world had narrowed to the size of an airway. She woke with her fists clenched and the taste of adrenaline on her tongue. For 3 full minutes, she sat very still on the edge of the bed, counting backwards from 100, slow breath after slow breath, until the room came back into focus. The house was quiet. Outside, a cricket was practicing violin. Ruby slid open the window and let the night into her lungs. It was not cure or miracle. It was a choice. Her phone lit the room. A message from Shannon, I can't sleep. The moon's loud tonight. You up? Ruby smiled for the first time that day. Yeah. Windows open. Shannon showed up with 2 mugs and a blanket. They sat on the porch steps, wrapped together. The moon did seem loud, a white coin pressing blessings into the field. Shannon tucked a curl behind Ruby's ear. What was it? She asked, not pushing, not prying. On scene, Ruby said. A pileup. Too many patients. Not enough hands. She exhaled, a shiver running through it. I kept working the same airway over and over, and every time I looked up, there was another face with the same eyes. Shannon's thumb traced a circle on Ruby's knee. You didn't come back broken. Feels like it. Feels like you did something impossible for too long. She tipped her head. Also, you still make tea like a hospital cafeteria. Rude. You love my honesty. I tolerate your honesty, Ruby corrected, laughing into her shoulder. When the horizon began to gray, Shannon stood and stretched. I have a deck build in the morning. Stay awake too long and I'll rivet my thumb to a joist. Ruby stood with her. Be careful. Always am. You gonna sleep? I'll try. Good. And Ruby? Yeah? Thanks for letting me in. Ruby watched her walk to the truck, watched the first light catch in Shannon's hair, and felt something settle. Not a cure, not a salve, just a commitment to show up for the day while the day was still willing to have her. On Monday, the county fair announced its dates, 2 weeks away, and the whole town started acting like it had swallowed fireworks. Banners went up. Teenagers practiced harmonies under the bleachers. The Hayes landscaping crew built the main stage with a speed that suggested they'd done it enough times to be muscle memory. Ruby was hauling scrap wood from the barn when she heard tires on gravel. The truck that pulled in was unfamiliar, sleek, shiny, anything but Hawthorne Ridge. The man who stepped out looked like a magazine ad for expensive watch faces, crisp shirt, shoes with no scuff ever. Ms. Lane, he said, hand extended, smile present but not practiced enough to feel honest. I'm Nolan Vargas, Pinecrest Development. Ruby frowned, not taking the hand. Can I help you? I hope so. He gestured toward the fields. We're acquiring property out this way. Your neighbors have sold. The county's eager for a tax base. We're offering well above market. Ruby glanced at the trees her aunt had planted the year Ruby was born. The thought of bulldozers chewing through those roots turned her stomach. Not interested. Nolan's smile didn't falter. Perhaps you might be, if you saw the numbers. I'm not interested in the numbers, she said. I'm interested in not paving over the last place. My aunt's laugh still echoes. Something ticked in his jaw. We'll be in touch. Don't be. He got back into his truck and was gone in a whir of dust that settled like a bad taste. Ruby stood very still, telling herself it was not her job anymore to fight every fire. And yet. That evening, she told Shannon. They sat on the tailgate of Shannon's truck, eating takeout lo mein, the chopsticks clicking like soft scoldings. He's been sniffing around town, Shannon said. Couple of folks sold. Most of us told him to take a hike. She set her container down. We'll handle it. We? Community. Shannon nudged her shoulder. Remember how that works? Ruby breathed out. Barely. Stick with me. Shannon winked. We'll retrain you. The first aid class filled up. By the time Ruby wandered into the community center to lurk at the back and consider her options, she found her name already written on the chalkboard, Instructor, Ruby Lane. In Shannon's handwriting. Betrayal had never looked so affectionate. Mutiny, Ruby muttered. Shannon, stacking chairs, looked delighted. Democracy at work. The people have spoken. I did not consent to this. You will when Mrs. Porter looks at you with those eyes that say she delivered half this town and can deliver you too if you make her. Ruby pinched the bridge of her nose. I hate how you're always right. You love it. Shannon kissed the air an inch from Ruby's cheek and then stepped aside as the first wave of people arrived. Ruby stood in front of the room, palms damp. A dozen faces looked back, Mrs. Porter with her white hair and the patience of a century, the teenagers from the market, Mr. Alvarez who ran the hardware store and had fingers like gnarled tree roots, a young mom with a baby on her hip and fear like a halo around her. Hi, Ruby said, and her voice didn't shake the way she'd braced for. I'm Ruby. We're going to talk about keeping people breathing until help arrives. We're going to talk about how to be scared and do the right thing anyway. She paused, found Shannon's eyes at the back of the room like a lit window. We're going to practice. No one becomes brave by accident. She taught them compressions that counted off like a stubborn metronome. She taught them the shape of a recovery position. She taught them to shout loudly and use names, because the brain remembers its own more reliably than a command. She taught them that their hands are better than their fear. At the end, Mrs. Porter came up and held Ruby's hand in both of hers. You did my heart good, she said, and Ruby felt that truth land and root. Shannon waited until the room cleared. How do you feel? Like I didn't drown. You didn't. You swam. Ruby laughed, soft and stunned. I guess I did. They turned off the lights and stepped into the evening. The sky wore bruised peaches. The town sounded like it was making dinner. On the sidewalk, Shannon stopped and faced her, eyes bright with something gentle and sure. Rubes, she said, voice hushed like the moment deserved ceremony. Can I kiss you now? Ruby didn't trust her voice. She nodded. Shannon's mouth met hers like a memory and a promise, familiar and new, lingering and asking. Ruby felt the years between them rearrange themselves into something they could walk across without falling through. She pressed closer, hands in Shannon's shirt, where the heat lived. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing like they'd run toward something. Okay, Shannon whispered, forehead resting against Ruby's. That's still there. It never wasn't. Hawthorne Ridge put on its county fair like a gold dress it only wore once a year. The main street shut down and the Ferris wheel rose from the asphalt like a miracle on stilts. The air tasted like sugar and smoke. Children clutched plush whales with the intensity of newly minted saints. A band played covers with enthusiasm that mostly made up for accuracy. Ruby and Shannon moved through the crowd as if called by the same compass. They tried and failed to win each other ridiculous prizes, ending with a keychain-sized rubber duck, a failure they both insisted counted as a moral victory. Shannon managed to charm a beekeeper into selling her a jar of honey he hadn't intended to part with. Ruby convinced the nurse from the clinic to stop working and try a funnel cake for the first time, then laughed when powdered sugar covered half the woman's face. At sunset, the sky went loud with gold. Ruby and Shannon climbed the Ferris wheel, the metal seat rocking gently as they rose. The town spread below them in patches of light and shadow, a quilt stitched out of lives that knew each other's first and middle names. Remember when you told me you were going to leave and never look back? Shannon asked, smiling sideways. I lied to myself more than I lied to you. At the top, Shannon said, you can see the water tower and the place where the river bends like a question mark. My dad used to tell me that meant the town was asking us something every day. What's the question? Are you brave enough to belong to something? Ruby looked out at the rooflines, the tiny people, the pop of fair lights turning on one strand at a time. She thought about Nolan Vargas and his clean shoes. She thought about the first aid class, about the teenagers memorizing the beat of a life they might need to hold in their hands. She thought about the house full of echoes and the garden learning her name again. She thought about the curve of Shannon's palm on her back. I think I'm getting there, Ruby said. Good, Shannon said, and kissed her in a seat that swayed like a breath. When they reached the ground, a siren ripped the air. Not the fairground's loudspeaker. Not a band. The sound cut sharp, volunteer fire. People stilled. Ruby's body did not ask permission, it was already moving. Where? She called to the nearest EMT, a 19-year-old with eyes too wide for the helmet on his head. Collapse stage, he said. Some beams gave. We've got entrapment. Shannon's hand closed around Ruby's wrist, a blink of fear. It lasted one heartbeat. Then she let go, eyes steady, voice even. Go. Ruby ran. Chaos has a language. Ruby remembered every verb fluently. She entered the scene at a jog, not a sprint. Speed is a liar, control a friend. The main stage had cracked along its left edge, a wedge of wood slid downward under the weight of two light trusses. A man lay half under a beam, pinned from pelvis to knee. A woman sat on the ground, keening, a raised welt across her temple. People orbited the damage in a panic that made their limbs useless. Hey! Ruby's voice found its command. You, in the red shirt, call out for people to move back 10 feet and form a line. You in the blue, get me the first aid kit from the booth. She dropped to her knees by the pinned man. I'm Ruby. I'm going to help you. He was gray around the mouth. His breathing was shallow but even. It hurts, he said, voice high with shock. I know. Stay with me. She turned to the nearest cluster of bodies. We need to lift the beam enough to slide a jack under. No one pulls him yet, pinning stanchioned the bleed. Mr. Alvarez materialized with a car jack and a section of 4x4 like a magician of hardware. Got you, he said, eyes calm in a way that unlocked options in Ruby's brain. On my count. Ruby positioned them, checked for pinch points, made sure shoulders squared and backs safe. 3. 2. 1. Lift, slow. The beam rose an inch, then 2. Ruby slid the jack under and cranked until the weight transferred. The man cried out. Talk to me, she said, voice low, a metronome to drown his fear. "I've got you," Shannon's voice said from the other side of the beam. Ruby glanced up. Shannon had a hand on the man's shoulder, her face professionally still, her mouth soft. "You're doing great, Ben." Ben. A name anchored something. Ruby felt it click, their training, their classroom. Names always help. "Okay," Ruby said to the crew. "We hold this, stabilize the beam with the 4x4. Mr. Alvarez, you're going to be a hero twice." "Good. Now, Shannon, I need your belt." Shannon slid it off and passed it without comment. Ruby turned it into a proximal thigh tourniquet as a safety, not yet tightened, just staged for when the pressure released. She met Shannon's eyes. They were the exact shape of "I trust you." "On 3, Ruby said. "Lift a hair more. I'll pull him clear." They did. She did. Ben screamed, a sound that would have haunted her once. Now it passed through her and out, like weather. Ruby tightened the belt as a tourniquet when the blood came. Shannon cut away the pant leg with a utility knife and hissed between her teeth at the mangled mess of tissue. "We've got you," Shannon said to Ben, voice steady. "You're going to tell your grandkids about the time 2 women at the county fair saved your stubborn self and your stubborn leg." The town's ambulance screamed in, doors cracking open like a promise. Ruby handed off, report quick and clean, male, mid-40s, crush injury left femur, tourniquet applied at 1941, conscious, oriented ×3, BP felt thready at radial, controlled bleed, time of entrapment approximately 8 minutes, no loss of consciousness observed. The EMTs nodded, grafting her calm onto theirs. The whole scene began to exhale. Afterward, Ruby backed away into the shadow of a tent and sat down hard on a bale of straw. Her hands finally remembered to shake. Shannon crouched in front of her, hands on Ruby's knees. Up close, Ruby saw a splatter of someone else's blood on Shannon's cheekbone. Without thinking, Ruby reached up and wiped it away with her thumb. "I know," Shannon murmured. "I know that look." Ruby stared at her hands. "I thought I was done." "You were done doing it alone." Shannon's smile tilted. "That's different." Ruby leaned forward, forehead against Shannon's collarbone. Shannon held her until the tremor left. The fair's sounds crept back in, the nervous laughter, the music restarting in a tentative trickle, the whole town insisting on joy as an act of defiance. When Ruby finally sat back, Shannon grinned, bright and wicked. "So. You're the storm, huh?" Ruby laughed, ragged and alive. "Not the damage," she said. "Just the one who runs toward it." "Exactly," Shannon said. "And I run toward you." Pinecrest Development did not take a hint. By the next week, Ruby received a certified letter with numbers that would have fixed every loose hinge in her life and left money to burn. She set the envelope on the counter and made herself a sandwich she did not eat. The afternoon sagged around her. She drove to the river instead, where the water stitched light to shadow in lazy patterns. Shannon found her there without being told. That was their new talent, showing up where the other one's silence pointed. "He doubled the offer," Ruby said, passing the letter. "Tripled, if I meet his timeline." "What do you want?" Shannon asked. "I want my aunt's laugh to keep echoing." Ruby's voice was even. "I want to plant trees and be here long enough to see them outgrow me. I want kids to find salamanders in the creek and think nothing of it. I want," she swallowed. "I want my life to happen slow enough to taste it." "Then that's your answer," Shannon said. "Money is just a volume knob. It doesn't change the song." Ruby laughed, helpless with affection. "You say things like that and then act surprised when I look at you like the sun. Please, I've always known I'm at least a medically inadvisable brightness. Definitely a hazard." They sat with their shoulders touching. A heron crossed the water as if it owned the patent on patience. A child along the bank shouted in triumph. Somewhere on Main Street, someone flipped a sign from open to closed and in doing so, told the town to go home and cook something with garlic. I want to fight this, Ruby said. Not just by saying no. I want to make it obsolete. Shannon grinned slow. Welcome back to belonging. They formed a coalition so quickly it felt like the town had been waiting for the cue. Mr. Alvarez handled permits and translated legalese into human. Mrs. Porter knew everyone's grandmother and could summon a potluck the size of a small nation. The teenagers ran social media with a fervor that frightened and impressed Ruby in equal measure. Shannon designed a plan for a community garden, a walking trail, and a river restoration project that would make the land harder to pave, politically, emotionally, logistically. Ruby stood at the first meeting in the community hall and listened to a flood of voices argue with care. She realized she was smiling the kind of smile you don't notice until your cheeks hurt. When the discussion turned to who would be the public face, Shannon squeezed Ruby's hand under the table. You, she said, mouth near Ruby's ear. People trust you. You hold them steady. I'll do it, Ruby said. On one condition. She lifted Shannon's hand onto the table and didn't let go. We do it together. The town didn't blink. They already knew. Pinecrest countered with glossy brochures of tasteful condos and a promise of a cafe that used the word artisanal too many times. The coalition countered with a day of service that turned the fallow field behind the community center into an orchard, a skate ramp, and a half-built gazebo in one weekend. The county commissioner, who had been leaning toward Pinecrest's tax dollars, brought his kids to plant a maple and left with dirt on his suit and a new appreciation for volunteer labor. Ruby gave interviews in jeans and a shirt streaked with paint and soil. She said things like, "We're not anti-progress. We're pro-place." She said, "Money lives a short life, roots live a long one." She said, "The land knows what it wants. We're listening." At night, when the town slept and the frogs took up their choral duties, Ruby and Shannon lay in the back of the truck on a blanket and mapped out dreams, rain barrels, a tool library, a grief group for first responders that met on Tuesdays in the church basement because the church's new pastor thought the holiest thing was letting people cry where the floor could hold it. Ruby told Shannon a story she'd never told anyone. The first time someone died in her hands, she was 22 and thought the world ended every day somewhere and it was her job to go find the end and introduce herself. She learned that naming endings also meant naming beginnings. She learned that living with both is a muscle. Shannon told Ruby the thing she hadn't written in the letter. I love you. I loved you then, and in the middle, and in the part where I tried to forget. I love you like a direction home. They didn't say forever, because forever is a word that breaks under misuse. They said tomorrow, and then tomorrow again, and every time they said it, they meant I'll still be here when the coffee's ready. It rained for 3 days straight, the kind of serious rain that reminded everyone who actually ran the place. The creek rushed its banks and the orchard drank like an athlete. Ruby and Shannon worked side by side in slickers, mud up to their shins, laughter hacking the edge off the cold. On the third day, Ruby answered a knock at the door and found Nolan Vargas, damp and impatient, holding a folder that had survived a battle. Last offer, he said, without preamble. You'll regret saying no. Doubtful, Ruby said. But I appreciate your concern. You think your little garden and your PTA army are going to stop us? His smile tried to be charming and landed on brittle. No, Ruby said pleasantly. I think the town's updated comprehensive plan that designates this area as community green space, the conservation easement we just signed with the land trust, and the county commissioner's re-election campaign that features him planting a tree with his kids might stop you. His face flickered. Also, Ruby added, I cooked brownies for the zoning board. I'm unstoppable. He narrowed his eyes. Hayes put you up to this. Hayes put me up to remembering I've always been someone who runs toward the thing that needs doing. She tilted her head. You can build somewhere else. You probably will. But not here. Not this. He stared a beat longer, weighing the cost of a fight he was already losing. Then he shoved the folder at her, water spotting its corners. You're making a mistake. Maybe, Ruby said. But it's going to be a beautiful one. He left, not with the roar of victory but the smallness of retreat. When the truck's sound dissolved into rain, Ruby leaned her head against the door and laughed until the sound braided with the storm and became one thing. Shannon walked in from the kitchen, a dish towel slung over her shoulder, eyebrows up. Did you just vanquish a developer with paperwork and baked goods? Plus a land trust and a man who loves his kids, Ruby said. A coalition of the willing. Shannon crossed the room and kissed her like punctuation. You terrify me in the hottest way. File under compliments. I'll be thinking about it inappropriate times. Good. They stood there a long minute, rain drumming its medieval chorus on the roof, both of them a little stunned at how saying no had felt like saying yes to everything that mattered. The first frost came early, slanting white light across the fields with a crispness that made the air bright in your lungs. The garden curled in on itself, seeds pulled tight as promises for spring. The coalition held a potluck under the gazebo they finished in the last glow of late summer. There was chili and cornbread and enough pie to keep the town sugared until February. Someone brought a guitar, someone else a fiddle, and a child with a paper crown declared herself mayor for the night and collected daisies as taxes. Ruby stood at the edge of the light and watched Shannon laugh with Mrs. Porter about something involving chicken wire and a goat with opinions. It hit Ruby then, with the gentlest force possible, that she had never loved anyone like this. Not with this many windows open. Not with this much air. Later, when the town went home to dishes and bedtime stories and the quiet clatter of lives settling in, Ruby and Shannon drove out to the ridge. They spread the blanket in the truck bed and lay shoulder to shoulder. The stars were ridiculous. Ruby tried to imagine explaining them to someone who'd never seen sky and then decided she'd rather just lie there and be proof of it. I used to think I had to choose, Ruby said. The version of me that saved people and the version that got to be held. You do both, Shannon said, simple as a weather report. Sometimes that looks like pulling someone from under a beam. Sometimes it looks like making soup and not asking questions until they're ready. Ruby turned on her side. What if I fail at both? Shannon turned too. Their noses almost touched. Then we try again. That's the whole game. Ruby swallowed. I love you. Shannon's smile started somewhere deep and worked its way up. There's my speech. You had one prepared? Had it for years. She kissed Ruby slow. I love you. Since we were idiots with skinned knees and borrowed courage. Since the day you left and I learned how to make my own coffee. Since you came back and taught me that running toward the thing that scares you is the only way to make it smaller. Ruby laughed into the kiss, relief and desire making the same shape. They pulled each other close until the cold complained and the blanket solved it. When they finally fell asleep, the stars kept watch like old ants sitting up late to make sure the house remembered how to be safe. Winter learned the town. Snow stitched roofs into a single sheet. The community center hosted soup nights that would have made a monastery jealous. Ruby ran the grief group on Tuesdays, and men who had never cried around other men cried, and nothing burned down, and the world kept turning in a slightly more honest way. Shannon's business boomed with decks that held snow like soft armor and carpentry that made rooms feel like someone had thought about the shape of you before building the wall. At night, they took turns reading a chapter before bed, their voices tucking each other in. The nightmares still visited, but less like hauntings and more like weather that passed. When Ruby did wake shaking, Shannon anchored a hand between Ruby's shoulder blades and breathed with her until their lungs matched, a duet that had learned itself by heart. In late January, the river froze in a thin lace. Ruby found the courage, at last, to open the box with Shannon's unfinished letter. She carried it to the kitchen and set it on the table like it might bolt. When Shannon came in, cheeks pinched pink from the cold, Ruby slid it forward. I found this the day you brought pie, Ruby said. I wasn't ready then. Shannon sat, eyes on the paper. Her smile tilted. I remember writing this. I stopped because I decided writing it down was a way of not saying it to your face. You can finish it now. Shannon took Ruby's hand. I love you, she said, which felt both like completing a sentence and starting a new book. I don't know the shape of every year, but I know the direction. I want to build a life where we forget to count because we're too busy living. Ruby laughed, watery. Be careful. I'll hold you to that. Please do. They kissed at the table with their hands still around the letter, as if making a contract with each other and with all the versions of themselves who'd survived long enough to get here. Spring returned the way it always does, in shy, green increments that convinced you nothing had ever been dead, only sleeping. The orchard went from a rumor to a certainty. The teenagers who had once written their names too large on a clipboard now led the town's Instagram with a restraint and beauty that made Ruby proud in a way she didn't know where to put. The creek ran clearer, thanks to the Saturday crews with their boots and their stubbornness. Salamanders returned, little commas rearranging the sentence of the bank. Ruby caught one and let it sit in her palm, slick and ancient, then set it back like a blessing. At the season's first farmer's market, the beekeeper who'd grudgingly sold Shannon honey last summer waved them over. You too, he said, presenting a jar with a ribbon. For the women who made the town remember its taste. Shannon bowed as if knighted. Ruby laughed. They wandered the stalls with that ridiculous feeling that happiness is illegal if you carry too much of it around. On the sidewalk, Nolan Vargas appeared again, but this time without the folder, without the edge. He nodded, cautious. Lane. Hayes. Ruby nodded back. Shannon did too. We're building over by Miller's Run, he said. Downstream from your parcel. Less sensitive. The county found us a way. Ruby's smile was small but real. Good. People need homes. He breathed out, as if he too had been braced for a fight and was relieved to be offered a truce. You were right about this place. Not me, Ruby said. Them. She gestured at the town, the tents, the baby asleep on a father's chest, the old men arguing about nothing under a sycamore that had seen worse. Nolan nodded. I'll buy you a coffee sometime. Not as a bribe. As diplomacy. Careful, Shannon said. She'll make you join a committee. I've survived worse, he said, and smiled for the first time like a person instead of an angle on a spreadsheet. When he walked away, Shannon leaned into Ruby. Look at you. Turning nemeses into neighbors. Soft power, Ruby said. And brownies. Never underestimate brownies. They bought radishes and a loaf of bread that threatened to be a personality. They bought lavender seedlings to replace the ones that had given up during the hard freeze. They walked home by the river because everything wanted to be near it now. On the porch, Shannon set the seedlings down and took Ruby's face in her hands. Marry me, she said, plain and certain. Ruby blinked, caught mid-breath. The world narrowed to the size of the porch steps and widened to the size of a life. Yes, she said, no hesitation, no fear. Yes. Shannon laughed, surprised and delighted in the same beat. I didn't plan a speech. You don't need one. Good, Shannon said. Because I was just going to say I want to build a thing with you that outlives us. Trees, Ruby said, grinning. Also a deck. And a kitchen where we always have too much time. And Tuesdays, Ruby said. And a community that argues and then shows up. And the kind of mornings where the house smells like coffee before we're even awake enough to know it. And a river. And a town that knows our names. And a you, Ruby said, softer than anything she'd ever said. Always you. They kissed in a way that made the house feel like it had been waiting for this moment since the day it was built. The wind moved through the pines like a choir warming up. Somewhere, a child laughed at a joke that would only be funny at 6 years old on a spring morning, which is to say, the purest kind of funny there is. They married under the gazebo the town built together. There were wildflowers in coffee cans and bread on every table. Mrs. Porter officiated because of course she did, and the vows were simple enough to memorize by accident. "I promise to run toward you," Shannon said. "I promise to run toward what matters, with you," Ruby answered. The river made its soft argument in the background. The teenagers cried like they were allergic to happiness. Mr. Alvarez wore a tie and pretended to hate it, and then hugged them both hard enough to undo the pretense. When it was done and the cake had been kissed off fingers and noses, they snuck away down the path to the bend in the river that looked like a question mark. "What's the town asking us now?" Ruby asked. Shannon looked at the water, at the trees that would one day shade two old women so in love with each other and their town that teenagers would roll their eyes and secretly hope for the same. "Same thing," she said. "Are you brave enough to belong?" Ruby laced their fingers together. "Yes," she said. "Every day that I get." They stood there until the lights slanted to amber. They walked back to their people, their place, their life that had taken the long way around to find them, which is how the best ones always arrive. The sound of sirens still visited Ruby sometimes, in the middle of a laugh or the middle of the night. But now, when they did, the world didn't narrow, it expanded. It had room for noise and quiet, room for grief and its twin, which was love, room for a woman who ran toward what hurt and a woman who held her, and a town that learned how to keep both of them, safe and loud and ordinary, under the same sky. And when the stars came out, old aunts again, keeping watch, the house that had once been a refuge became a home, not because of the walls but because of the lives that kept crossing its threshold, mud on their boots and pie in their hands and names on their lips. Ruby turned her face toward Shannon's shoulder. "Listen," she said. Shannon smiled into her hair. "I hear it." "What?" "Everything," Shannon said. "And you. Always you." The end. Thanks for listening. If small-town sapphic love is your jam, subscribe for daily audiobooks.